Good morning and afternoon, everyone. My name is Aaron Gorell, and thank you for participating in today's 432nd webinar, Sustainable Crime Gun Intelligence Strategies Require Policy-Driven Tactics. You know, whether you're implementing a regional or agency-wide preventive crime gun strategy, the establishment of formal policies is a critical factor that must be addressed. These policies can be wide-ranging in scope, affecting entire local, regional, or national populations, and they can be narrow in scope, affecting only a single organization. Fortunately, today there are many resources to assist law enforcement and lab personnel to develop these formal policies, beginning with the International Association of Chiefs of Police 2012 Resolution on Regional Crime Gun Processing Protocols and the 2018 resolution on support for development of comprehensive crime gun intelligence strategies, as well as the recently adopted firearm recovery model policy. Led by IACP Firearms Committee member Pete Gagliardi and retired ATF Chief Firearms Operations Division Michael Eberhardt, this webinar will provide attendees with an in-depth discussion into the process of developing meaningful and sustainable crime gun intelligence policies, as well as strategies that have been implemented to ensure these policies are followed. Our first presenter is Pete Gagliardi, who is the Principal Officer of Triple Barrel Strategies, LLC. His consultancy company provides thought leadership and strategic planning support to help governments develop sustainable solutions aimed at bringing justice to the victims of gun violence. Pete has over 46 years of experience extracting useful information from crime guns and related evidence in both the public and private sectors. 16 of those years, he served as a senior vice president with Ultra Electronics Forensic Technology, and 30 of those years were in law enforcement, most of which were focused on the investigation of firearms and explosives related crimes with the BATF. Our second presenter is Michael Eberhardt, who's a national crime gun intelligence strategy with 26 years of experience as a special agent with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. He held leadership positions in ATF from 2014 until retiring as the chief of ATF's Firearms Operations Division in 2019. Michael has worked with ATF's National Integrated Ballistic Information System, NIBIN, since 2001 in New Orleans, Louisiana, and other locations, later becoming a Crime Gun Intelligence Center supervisor and building a robust NIBIN program in Philadelphia. Eberhardt was the head of ATF's NIBIN and CGIC programs in Washington, D.C., and served as the chair of the National Crime Gun Intelligence Governing Board, where he led the creation of sound national policy for both programs. Before we begin, I'd like to extend a special thanks to our friends and partners for helping us with this webinar. Today's webinar is done in partnership with Ultra Electronics Forensic Technology. We truly appreciate working with organizations like Ultra Electronics Forensic Technology, who are committed to enhancing and growing the law enforcement and criminal justice professions. Now, the last few things I'd like to address with everyone before we begin is some basic housekeeping items. First, this event is being recorded and the formal presentation is scheduled to last about 60 minutes. It'll be available to subscribers on the Justice Clearinghouse website later today. Second, this is a listen-only event, but you can type in any questions you have for Mike and Pete through the GoToWebinar toolbar, and we'll take as many of those questions as possible at the end of the formal presentation. Next, if you experience any audio issues during the webinar, such as the sound cutting in and out intermittently, consider dialing in using the phone number included in your emailed invite. And when the system asks for a PIN, you can bypass that by hitting the pound key. We have incorporated a polling question into this webinar. You'll need access to your keyboard and mouse to participate. And just by way of a trial run, I'd actually like to ask the first question, which is, how much continuing education does your profession require on an annual basis? Your options are 0 hours, 1 to 10 hours, to 11 to 20 hours, 21 to 30, and more than 30 hours. And as is tradition with these polling questions, we give folks just about 30 seconds to respond, and then I'll go ahead and close out the poll. Thank you so much for participating, and share the results. And it looks like about 38% of you do not require any continuing education. 20% require 11 to 20 hours, 18% more than 30 hours, and then tied at 12% each are 1 to 10 and 21 to 30. Again, thank you for participating. Our presenters have made a handout available to you through the GoToWebinar toolbar under Handouts. I would encourage you to take a look and download it. It's a list of extremely useful resources, that you might be able to implement as you're considering your own policies. Finally, after today's webinar, there will be a follow-up survey, and we ask that you complete it. Your feedback helps us shape pretty much everything we do here at the Justice Clearinghouse. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn the presentation over to you, Pete. It's all yours.
Thank you, Aaron. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the privilege of your time today. As you can see on the slide in front of you, Dean Koontz, the novelist, I think summed up what I think crime gun intelligence really is. And he says, if your work is death work, one weapon's not enough. Just as a plumber would not answer an urgent service call with a single wrench. So crime gun intelligence is about many, many things, many tools in the crime-solving toolbox. And so I think we'll start the presentation. Aaron, you might want to run that quick poll.
You bet. The polling question is open, and the question is, does your agency have policies for the comprehensive collection and timely processing of comprehensive crime gun intelligence? And very straightforward, the responses are yes, no, and unsure. And as before, we'll give people about another 15 seconds or so to respond. And Pete, I am curious here, have you seen approximately what percentage of agencies around the country have policies like this?
Actually, I'm really looking forward to this poll, Aaron.
Got it. I'm going to go ahead and close down the poll and share the results. Pete, 60% of the audience indicated yes, 24% indicated no, and 16% were unsure. Does that kind of go with what you've seen nationally?
So I think sort of rule of thumb, yeah, a sort of experience. It's a pleasant surprise in a way. So Aaron, let's go to the next slide and talk about what crime gun intelligence is. So if we break down the term crime gun intelligence into two elements, one crime gun and one intelligence, and we look at the term crime gun, ATF has a pretty good definition of that. Any firearm illegally possessed, used in a crime, or suspected to have been used in a crime. And this also includes firearms found where the proper disposition can only be facilitated through a firearms trace. The next slide, we'll talk about the word intelligence. And we'll talk about it from the perspective of law enforcement, not from the intelligence purist perspective. So intelligence combines credible information with quality analysis and evaluation from which conclusions may be drawn. Now, the International Chiefs of Police sort of looked at this through police-colored glasses, and they're calling criminal intelligence that is based on circumstances leading to the reasonable suspicion that a crime has been or is about to be committed. The next slide, we'll talk about where we find crime gun intelligence. And the answer is it's found in many places. There's various types and sources of this data and information. I'll talk about a lot of them in a second. But the firearm itself is a good place to start. And let's take a look at that firearm at the next slide. So on the inside of the gun, the internal ballistics, everyone's familiar with that. Those are the unique marks that are left on fired ammunition components, bullets and cartridge cases as they go through the discharge process. On the outside of the gun, we have the opportunity to find other types of crime gun intelligence. DNA, the make, model, and serial number used for crime gun tracing through ATF's E-Trace program. We have the opportunity to find trace evidence, blood, biomaterials, hairs, fibers. And then lastly, also the opportunity to find fingerprints on the firearm and often on the magazine itself. So what tells the whole story? Well, it's a simple formula. The inside information plus the outside information will give you the whole story. Moving on to the next slide, let's look at the different types of crime gun intelligence. It's important that we layer and leverage all our crime gun intelligence in a way very similar to building the cables on a suspension bridge, where we wrap up different ropes of information, whether it be trace evidence, whether it be the RMS data, local police intelligence, geomapping, NIBIN, E-trace, gunfire detection technology data, latent prints, security cameras, automatic license plate reading systems, DNA. Many things can be crime gun intelligence. The important thing is that we layer and leverage these systems together, tie them up into a cable, so we develop a very strong program. The next slide, I'll talk about tagging all the bases. Just as a home run in baseball won't score if the base runner fails to tag a base, an investigator missing a base inside or outside the gun, or in any other area, for example, may never learn the full story that every crime gun holds. But on the next slide, we'll see another very important element to all of this crime gun intelligence area, and that is the processes that you use to collect, extract, analyze, and disseminate crime gun intelligence must be timely to meet the needs of the investigators. On the next slide, we'll talk about what it takes to develop a timely and sustainable crime gun intelligence program. Well, it takes the balance of three things: people, processes, and technology, lined up sort of like a three-legged stool that will hold up the weight of the program that you're trying to place upon it. On the next slide, I'll expand on this a little more. In terms of people, I'm really referring to cross-jurisdictional teamwork. And the people that are involved, the key stakeholders, if you would, come from three major groups: the police, forensics, and prosecutors. In terms of processes, I'm talking about policy-driven tactics, written standard operating procedures, general directives, general orders. These policies need to call into favor accountability. They need to be reviewed. People need to be accountable for doing what they say they're going to do. And lastly, in terms of technology, again, the technology systems must be applied in a layered and leveraged way, sort of like that cable bridge analogy I just used. On the next slide, we'll talk about the policy versus handshakes. Now, there are a lot of people out there in this business, as you all well know, that are very innovative, very dedicated, very gung-ho to get the job done. And thank God for these folks, because these are the folks at the police department who might have good connections at the laboratory that have entered into a handshake to get things done in a very fast, efficient, and accurate way. But there's a problem with handshakes compared to policies. Handshakes over time start to dissipate as people get retired, get transferred, move on to other things. The people that were in place that made those handshakes after a year or two or three aren't there anymore. And there's new people in place. And the handshakes that were put in place earlier really don't carry any weight anymore. So things start to fall apart. Policies, on the other hand, last forever until they're changed. They enforce collaboration, communicate vision, strategies, tactics. They identify what needs to be done, who needs to do it, when and how. They talk about the expectations of the participants. Many times they include performance measures and quality assurance procedures. We'll talk a little bit about big P and small p policy on the next slide. So policy can be big P or little p. And what I mean by big P policy, for example, in New Jersey, there is actually a state law mandating any law enforcement agency in New Jersey that recovers a crime gun pursuant to an investigation do at least three things: NCIC it, E-Trace, and NIBIN. And that's the law in New Jersey. Before that law was passed, just a NIBIN check alone took the New Jersey State Police an average of 6 to 10 months to complete. On the next slide, we'll see what they do today. Today, New Jersey State Police does all this in 24 hours, every gun, every time. They intake it, safety check it, preserve it. A CSI across the hall takes the gun into his or her area. They do a visual for biomaterials and trace evidence. They process it for latent prints, swab it for DNA. And when I'm talking about DNA and my processes here, I'm really talking about the DNA swabbing process. I'm not really referring to, at this point in time, actually typing the swabs to determine the presence of DNA. But at least if we swab it at this point, we're able to preserve the swab, because as we go along in the investigation, we may want to go back and process that for DNA. At one point, if the serial number is defaced, they'll take some quick photographs of it, but the gun then goes right into ballistics, where it's NIBINized. Once it's NIBINized, if the serial number needs to be restored, it gets restored. Once the operators of NIBIN determine a potential hit, the information goes out on a central distribution list, where a number of partners, NIBIN partners throughout New Jersey, whether they are police, prosecutors, or forensic folks, have signed up in advance to get these notifications. So there's not a matter of thinking, who do I send this to? The people that were interested, that had a legitimate reason to know, in the effort of sharing crime gun intelligence throughout the state, are all signed up. All they do, attach a standard form that all of the ballistic labs in New Jersey utilize, click send, and it's off. One of the places that it goes is the Regional Crime Gun Intelligence Center, where they begin to extract information that can be of additional help to the investigators. But notwithstanding, the investigators already have the NIBIN lead. They're already running with it in terms of any investigative leads that are obvious. And the Regional Crime Gun Center is simply doing some backup work to develop additional information and supply that to the investigators. Let's look at some other actions on the next slide in terms of big P policy. The state of Delaware has passed a law mandating that when a crime gun is recovered in Delaware, it be NIBINized, NCIC, E-traced, and they also put into their law that the police, the prosecutors, and the forensic labs work together on the development of these protocols. Nevada, this past June, Nevada just passed a similar law mandating NIBIN. They've limited it right now to counties that have over 100,000 in population, because of the rural areas in some of the states that would have made it very difficult to get any ballistics evidence to NIBIN in a timely manner. However, as the populations grow, that law may grow with it. Now, California has a bill under consideration right now in their legislature. It's the second year it pops up in their legislature. Last year it was tabled. We're watching that and see where that goes. On the next slide, we'll talk about little p policy. So policy can be little p. What I mean by that is it could be at an agency level. And whether it's big P or little p, they both can be game changers, only if adhered to. So while policy can drive actions, only adhered to policy can sustain them. And that's why review and accountability are key. So I go back over 12 years ago with the West Palm Beach Police Department. They were pioneers in this area of policy for crime gun intelligence. And they partnered with the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office so that the Sheriff's Office could expand a model policy across approximately 25, 26 police agencies that the Sheriff's Department serves as a forensic services provider. I've outlined an in-depth case study of the Palm Beach County process in my book, The 13 Critical Tasks. And I think that it serves as a model and as a recognition as pioneers in this area. So let's talk about some, on the next slide, some additional policy support and encouragement that we get from the International Chiefs of Police. And in 2012, the Firearms Committee of the IACP promulgated a resolution to the membership of the IACP that was adopted at their 2012 annual conference in San Diego. And if we go to the next slide, I'll be able to pick up a little bit more information for you. I think as you look at this slide, there are a number of very key points. And right up there where it says resolved. Well, first of all, the IACP views regionally applied crime gun and evidence processing protocols as a best practice for the investigation of firearm-related crimes. Excuse me, I got to wet the whistle here. And encourages law enforcement officials, prosecuting attorneys, and forensic experts to collaborate, think, and act together on the design of mutually agreeable protocols that are best suited for their region. There is no one size fits all here. However, there are a number of bases that should always be tagged. And what you see on the screen next are 6 critical elements. I'm sorry. Oh, Aaron, would you just go back 1 second? Thank you. What you see below on the bulleted points are a number of critical areas. These are the bases that should be tagged. These are the things that should be considered when building a basic crime gun intelligence strategy. The thorough investigation of each gun-related crime, every gun, every crime, every time, including the safe and proper collection. The performance of NCIC transactions in terms of not only checking for stolen, but entering as recovered. The timely and comprehensive tracing of all crime guns through ATF and E-Trace. The timely processing of crime gun test fires and ballistics evidence through NIBIN. The timely lab submission and analysis of other forensic data from crime guns and related evidence, DNA, latent prints, trace evidence, so on. And lastly, and most importantly, the generation, dissemination, and investigative follow-up of the intelligence derived from the application of those regional protocols. You could take me to the next one, Aaron. So as a follow-up to that resolution that I just described, which is simply a statement of what the IACP believes. In 2018, they took it a step further and actually published a model policy for firearm recovery to handle the upfront first element of crime gun intelligence, the collection. So job one was the response and collection of initial crime gun intelligence and evidence at the scene. And the policy speaks to what goes on at the scene, the identification of persons and interviews, different documentation and evidence collection, conducting relevant database queries like E-Trace, NCIC, NIBIN, and forensic exams, plus follow-up and reporting. Now, the policy can be accessed online on the IACP website by any IACP member. Now, most of you listening have someone in your agencies that is an IACP member. So if we would go to the next slide, the IACP did not stop here. In 2018, they adopted a second resolution on this subject entitled Support for Development of Comprehensive Crime Gun Intelligence Strategies, again submitted by the IAC Firearms Committee. And in this resolution, they're indicating their belief that they want to strongly encourage all law enforcement agencies to establish protocols that ensure that recovered firearms and other ballistics evidence are appropriately subjected to E-Trace, NCIC, NIBIN, DNA, etc. But beyond that, they resolve that they support the creation of crime gun intelligence strategies that are comprehensive. And they urge all agencies to look at the National Crime Gun Intelligence Governing Board's Best Practices Guide and consider the establishment of such strategies to better coordinate and support firearm-related criminal investigations. Now, this Best Practices Guide is something that ATF and the National Crime Gun Intelligence Governing Board has produced. And I know Mike Eberhardt, who will be coming up next, will be talking more about that in depth. But why reinvent the wheel? This document is chock full of outstanding best practices. So let's go to the next slide and see why we do this. What is the goal? Why should we do any of this? First of all, let's propose that we're going to want to effectively enforce the laws on the books. We've got laws, and that's what we hear many, many times as a refrain from people on the left and the right. Enforce the laws on the books. But why do we enforce the laws on the books? To seek justice for the victims, resolution for their loved ones, and peace for their neighbors. What better reasons? What a better way to operate? So now I'm going to turn this presentation over to a friend and colleague, Mike Eberhardt, and he will take it from there. We'll start with the next slide. He'll give the transition. And then Mike, you got it, my friend.
Thanks, Pete. I appreciate it. So the good folks over at FT asked me to be on a webinar about policy, and of course I accepted and started to think about what that would look like. And this first slide is my thoughts about policy and why are we doing this and what are we doing, and also how crime gun intelligence and some of the technology impacts the environment in which we are creating policy and implementing policy. And as I started to think about it, you know, policy is a common word. I've enacted policy, I've been affected by policy, I've lived with policy all my career, but never really dove down into what it is. And I think it's important to have a discussion, and I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to have a discussion about how CGI and how crime gun intelligence and how some of this technology is changing that environment. So policy generally is addressing three factors. Obviously, standardized operating procedures such as dress code or prohibited behavior. And the second, internal environmental changes. If there was a budget increase or budget deficit, if there was a new unit or a new branch instituted by an organization, that would probably come with policy to address those changes. And then the one that I want to focus on a little bit as I go through is the external environmental changes that occur that an organization operates within, and how the external environmental changes sort of obligate some thought, at least, to policy implementation and policy change. Body cams, obviously, gunshot detection systems, IBIS technology and the NIBIN program are external environmental changes that have popped up over the last, 5-7 years that have got us thinking about what does the policy look like and how do we implement it effectively. Now, on this slide still, the last two policy change, of course, policy's kind of got a bad word. It feels like change. And two things people hate are the way things are and change. And so a lot of what you hear when policy starts to be instituted is, why do you want me to change the way I do things when what I've been doing for so many years has been working out just fine? And that's a really good question. And one that pops up a lot in crime gun intelligence. So on the next slide, let's look at what policy is. What are we trying to do with policy? Well, it's a response to a stated objective, and Pete touched on that, and you saw that a little bit in some of Pete's slides, that there were stated objectives and policy moves towards those objectives. So let's take, for example, an organization has an objective to process crime gun test fires and ballistic evidence through NIBIN within 24 to 48 hours of recovery. Policy instituted or policy should drive towards that objective. And what happens generally is that the policy is created or written. It is then reviewed through the organization or agency protocols, which includes department heads, probably senior leaders of the department or organization. It goes to legal where they're touching it and fine tuning it. And then very often it comes out a little bit askew of the objective. And I think that it's important to consider. I've done this erroneously in implementing policy, is getting finally to the policy and realizing I'm a little farther from the objective that I initially believed that I was going after. So that's one of the key points I want to make, is policy drives towards an objective, and it probably should not be instituted without a clear objective in mind, especially when we're talking about policy that includes change, which, as I said, is an extraordinarily difficult prospect with an organization change. So on the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about what policy is dependent upon and kind of change this up. Everybody knows communication and accountability, but I wanted to talk about communication and accountability in a different way when it comes to policy, especially policy surrounding crime gun intelligence. Communication of the details of the policy are critically important, and that it's common sense, but communication of the objective is also, I think, a critically important piece to developing policy and instituting policy and keeping policy maintained. The communication of the objective that we desire as an organization to disrupt the shooting cycle by apprehending serial shooters and prosecuting them to the fullest extent of the law is one everyone's going to agree with that. That's pretty much settled, that is a sound objective. So the policy that follows or drives towards that objective is easier to swallow for an organization when that policy is creating change. And these policies definitely create change. Now, accountability, and Pete mentioned accountability a little bit, simply cannot have policy without accountability. It's a struggle with most organizations, but certainly accountability is one of those. But accountability has that sort of I did something wrong feel about it. I've done something wrong and now I'm accountable for it. But I think that we need to, when we're talking about crime gun intelligence policies, and probably all policy, include in that accountability reinforcement of proper action, or a feedback loop that starts to impart into employees that the following of the policy is moving the organization, or has moved the organization towards the objective or attained the objective. And I think that that is an important part of the accountability side as well. So communication and accountability, but not in their strictest sense of definitions. Communication of the objective and consistent communication of the objective, I think, is critically important. And also reinforcement of proper action in accountability. Not only I'm in trouble, but also I did a really good job. I moved the organization towards the objective. So on the next slide, let's talk about a secondary factor, that one that I have experienced, and probably everybody's experienced, and I think it's one that doesn't necessarily get the attention. A policymaker, a person in a senior leadership position inside of an organization, clearly has the right and authority to institute policy and walk away from it. That, though, is not obviously the best way to do things. Culture is a major important factor when you're determining. I've been in the field with ATF, or I was in the field with ATF for a very long time. I've done stints in ATF headquarters, and I can tell you those cultures are absolutely different. And I could not carry policy that I had in the field into headquarters and hope to sustain it. So policy that conflicts with culture has an uphill battle. It's not that it can't be done, but it certainly has an uphill battle. And I think some of the strategies to communicate objectives really help that uphill battle. Pete talked about handshakes versus policy. Everyone can agree with that. That's an extremely good point. But I'm adding to that a little bit in cultural change. Cultural change does even what policy sometimes fails to do. And a real good sense for what the culture is, and communicating the objectives of my policy, and assuring that my accountability includes reinforcement of good action, I think starts to turn the culture that really sustains programs. We've all experienced that, or probably have been the training officer or the senior employee telling the brand new employee, don't worry so much about what you learned in the academy. I'm going to show you exactly how we're going to get things done. That's culture, and it will beat policy if senior leaders aren't very, very careful on how they develop and implement policy. So on the next slide, let's talk about CGI policy, or we'll pull this policy into the crime gun intelligence world, because it has changed. It's created an interdependence, crime gun intelligence has, between not only disciplines, but also jurisdictions. We're linking shooting events to crime gun recoveries, to crime gun purchases. It's linking jurisdictions. It's linking enforcement to forensics, patrol to investigations. It's blurring the lines of federal, state, and local jurisdictions. Everybody is all in on this because of the objective. The objective is safer communities. The objective is to identify and arrest shooters. So this has created an environment where policy is a little different than I think what we're used to having. My policy, and on the next slide, my policy ought to consider my objective and how my policy is going to affect all of the disciplines necessary. So if my objective is to process the crime gun test fires and ballistic evidence through NIBIN within 24 to 48 hours of recovery, attainment of this objective may require policy in more than one area. I may need to write policy separate for patrol that moves towards that objective, for evidence intake and processing that moves towards that objective, and for the laboratory or NIBIN site. And the slide that Pete put up about New Jersey State Police and their processes for intaking crime guns certainly reflects that. Everybody is affected. And so crime gun intelligence, as it has made us interdependent, it has also made policymakers have to consider, or need to consider, how I need to write effective policy to include everybody that's going to be affected to attain the objective. Again, always looking to create policy and implement policy towards an objective. So on the next slide is the minimum required operating standards, at least the first three. I think this is online. It's been available and in public domain for at least a year now. So everybody probably has that. The webinar did mention that we were going to discuss the minimum required operating standards. I'm not going to go into each minimum required operating standards because it has been in the next. If we go to the next slide, we'll see the next the last four here, 4, 5, 6, and 7. These are. If you pop to the next slide, please, Aaron. I'm going to go into what these are over necessarily the details of them. They're not policy. They're objectives. And I don't want to slide back and forth between slides and bounce back up, but you can look at each one of these and you can see that they're objectives. Now, why and what is the reason? What is the objective? Well, the objective is clearly to provide the investigator, the violent gun crime investigator, information that is extraordinarily relevant to violent gun crime and their ability to apprehend a shooter, to do that as quickly as possible. That's the objective. And I don't think there's much argument anymore about whether that objective is a sound one or not a sound one. It certainly is. And so what MROS is doing is laying out objectives, the policy and the individual policies. And Pete made a good point of mentioning that there are different agencies, there are different resources, there are different environments in which law enforcement agencies, laboratories, prosecutors' offices are working in, and that is where the policy is created at that level. The objectives, however, are ones that I think that we've all agreed to. I do some traveling around as the chief FOD and even retired, and I have the ability to meet with people in crime gun intelligence centers, talk to law enforcement officials and laboratory folks, and it struck me most recently that I'm sitting at a table talking about crime gun intelligence strategies, and at the table are disciplines all with a vested interest in the outcome. This is not true, as I recall, law enforcement some 10 years ago. Some 10 years ago, the meeting about shooters and investigating gun crime involved the police, maybe the prosecutor's office, but probably not. Now, with crime gun intelligence and this technology and the way this is moving and the environment by which we find ourselves now, we don't have a choice. The environment is there. The technology exists. It includes the table now. The stakeholders include every single forensics laboratory, NIBE site, prosecutors, federal, state, and local. And Pete hit on it, and you could see it themed through his presentation and through his slides, that everybody is a stakeholder. Everybody has a stake in the outcome of this policy. And so that has changed the way we're looking, I think, at policy and strategy, much different than what it used to be 10 years ago. So why? And I said in an earlier slide to not only communicate the objectives, but communicate why the objectives. And I don't know that this is exactly the answer, but it certainly is one that comes to my mind immediately. We're obliged to know as a law enforcement community what we are able to know when it relates to death work. I took the death work quote from Pete's first slide there, Dean Koontz, but we are obliged to know, let's think about that just for a second, what we are able to know. We're able to connect shootings. We're able to know who purchased that firearm. We're able to know the inside and out, as Pete mentioned it, of that firearm. We are obliged to know it. And so the objectives are sound. The policy and the way that we're going to implement that is going to be the challenge. It's been met in a number of departments and a number of laboratories and a number of places around the country as new departments and new laboratories are coming online with NIBE and new CGICs are being established. Then certainly these folks are developing brand new policy, but the objective remains the same. On the next slide, there are the resources that Pete spoke about with MROS. These are all public domain. You can click on the link and you get to that, get to the documents necessary to take a look at. Let's see, that the middle one is the minimum required operating standards audit, which is a really good document that goes into a lot of detail about MROS. So on the next slide, to summarize it, I'll start summarizing it up a little so there's plenty of time for questions. I know that there might be some questions on MROS and I'd be happy to field those, but policy has a design and it's designed to address three factors. With the one that we're speaking of, with crime gun intelligence, the one that we're focused on is the external change, that external environment that's caused us to think differently about the way we do things. And it is a tactical response to an objective. We have an objective. We want to do a certain thing as an organization, and we need to develop policy and then maintain that policy towards that objective. And then communication and accountability, which I think are two very important words and processes to consider. Because the communication isn't just of the policy details, it must be the objective as well. Obviously, an organization of people are going to be able to get behind impacting violent gun crime. And then accountability. That's a word that I struggle with because it is a trouble word. I'm in trouble. But as I mentioned, the accountability portion of this can include positive feedback and positive reinforcement. And there's a feedback loop in the NIBIN processes that is extremely important to help people understand I'm helping move towards the organization's objective, which is one that is worthy towards moving to. The next slide will be the final summary slide. The policy in conflict with culture is going to be difficult. Senior leaders who are implementing policy and who are designing policy sometimes have to choose the hill they're going to die on carefully. A senior leader can certainly institute policy and ram it down everybody's throat and it be the final word. I have found that is an ineffective way of doing things. So that does not necessarily mean that the organization need stay away from policy that's painful. Change is sometimes painful for an organization, but certainly you have to consider culture and be very careful about which one you choose to stick with, even though it's not working out. The other thing, and it's not on the slide, but it's something that I considered as when I was a chief of FOD and as the CGIC supervisor in Philadelphia. It was not uncommon. It was not necessarily common, but I understood sometimes when I instituted a policy at a local level like that or at a national level in headquarters that it didn't work the way that I thought that it would work. It's not moving anyone towards the objective. It had second or third order effects that were not considered by all the people that thought about the policy. A very tough thing for a senior leader and a very tough thing for an organization, and I wouldn't make a habit out of it, but a very tough thing is to rescind. But I think that it needs to be a tool in the toolbox of policy. It's very, very difficult, especially in large organizations, to consider second and third order effects of policy. And especially in crime gun intelligence, where we are now touching many different disciplines inside of an organization and very often many jurisdictions, that if it's doing more harm than good, rescinding is not necessarily a bad thing. If you rescind 3 times in a row, that is probably trouble in a different area. CGI policy has to consider and does consider across jurisdictions and disciplines. And I mentioned that, and I mentioned that is probably the primary change that's made us think about policy differently. CGI is just linking disciplines and jurisdictions together. Firearms are being purchased in one state, they're being used in violent crime in another state, and they're being recovered in another state. And that requires policy and thought that's different than what we have been used to in the past. And then, of course, on MROS are objectives. And I think that that's important also to look at the MROS as objectives. I was with ATF, I was in FOD when the National Crime Gun Intelligence Governing Board recommended that there be standardized processes for working in NIBIN and recommended the minimum required operating standards. I was in FOD when I accepted the recommendations, politic for the recommendations with the senior leaders inside ATF. And I think that they're important, but they are not policy. They are objectives to move towards. Now, the question is, can we disagree on the objectives, or would there be disagreement on the objectives? I'm not sure that there is, because what we decided the objective was to provide investigators critical information to a violent crime investigation so they can disrupt that shooting cycle, apprehend the violent criminal, and remove them from the community. That, as I mentioned, is probably beyond argument. The policy to deal with those objectives, the policy to move towards those objectives is done at the local level or done at the local stakeholder level. As Pete put up the slide, New Jersey State Police did it in the way that they did it. It's an extremely effective way to do it, but it might not necessarily be the best everywhere. But certainly, MROS was not designated as policy. It was designated and published as objectives. Policy is at the tactical level and at the agency level, at the laboratory level. The next slide has a list of additional resources. These are all extremely, there's a ton of resources out there, not just the ones that Pete brought up, but those are really important. But there are, I think the handout is going to be provided to all the attendees. So that you can take a look at these. There are some best practices, there are some model policy recommendations, and of course some strategy ideas. So the resources are out there. People have been struggling with this crime gun intelligence policy for the last 7-8 years. They've been instituting and rescinding when necessary to try to push all of their organization, and now ATF as a leader in it, towards impacting violent gun crime, safer communities. That's the objective. Not everyone's going to get it right every single time, but there are a lot of places that have done an extremely good job. And so these resources are, I think, critical to taking a look at that as you're setting up or considering policy that addresses crime gun intelligence. So that's all I have, and I think that it's going to be open for questions now, Aaron.
Yep, absolutely. Mike, Pete, thank you both so much for an incredibly thoughtful webinar on how to develop these crime gun intelligence policies in your agencies and in your communities. Folks, we've received a number of really great questions. We do have time for more. Please submit them through the GoToWebinar toolbar, and we'll get through as many as possible. I do want to make sure that everyone knows that they can download that handout that Mike, you referenced off of the GoToWebinar toolbar under handouts, and also let you know that we are actually planning another crime gun intelligence webinar on November 6th, when Ultra will be back to talk about grant writing strategies for preventive crime gun initiatives. And again, that's November 6th. Mark it on your calendar, and we'll get that posted to the Clearinghouse website in the next couple of days. Okay, Mike and Pete, I'm going to throw these questions out there, and I'll let both of you answer them. One of you answer whatever you guys think it's appropriate, if you're ready to start going through some of them.
Ready.
Absolutely.
Perfect. Our first question comes in from Steve. He wants to know, what is the status of the ATF Correlation Center in Huntsville?
I'll give that to Mike. Mike, I think was.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm able probably to address it. I've just been out of ATF and out as the FOD chief for 3 or 4 months now, and I kind of keep up to date on it. They have moved to a new facility in Huntsville. It's really nice. It has room for expansion. They're operating on about 100 correlation review specialists now, doing correlation reviews, continually taking on new sites as they expand. The employees down there are doing an amazing job. If you can go to the ATF website, public-facing website, and take a look at some of the photos of the new correlation center, it's really great. So the status is it's continuing to expand. It's funded. It's going to continue to take on new sites as the expansion continues, with obviously the hopes to be able to have the ability to take on every operating NIBIN site in the country by the end of 2020.
Great, thank you for that insight. Our next question comes in from Richard, and he says, we are seeing a lack of trust in NIBIN, and many detectives want extensive microscopic comparisons of evidence between various crime scenes due to NIBIN only being a presumptive result, not definitive. This tasks crime labs to not only meet ATF MROS requirements, but have staffing available to handle microscopic comparative cases. How would you suggest educating detectives, etc., to strengthen their faith in NIBIN leads and reduce multi-crime scene intercomparisons? Do you have any suggestions about potential policy? And thank you, Richard, for that great question.
Well, this is Pete. I'll take a stab at that. And I would recommend, first of all, that if the lab is asking the question, that the lab sit down with its police counterparts and prosecutor counterparts and initiate the discussion amongst the three major entities. Peel away the onion skin and find out what is really at the heart of this. Are we dealing with detectives, one or two that have loud voices and tend to speak on behalf of everyone? Is this really an issue? What should the policy be to balance the objectives, like Mike has said, to provide timely investigative leads to the police officers when we don't even have a suspect yet? I don't see why we're so worried about getting so far down in the weeds about proving beyond a reasonable doubt when we haven't even arrived at a suspect. So, you know what? There's three things that have to be in balance: people, processes, and technology. And the people leg of the stool is the hardest one to deal with. And the only way to deal with it in today's environment, because of the cross-jurisdictional teamwork required, is that the discussions have to take part amongst the cross-jurisdictional team.
I would add on to that just real quick also that a drug suspect that has a positive Scott reagent drug test kit that gets clipped and goes to jail for that and then pleads guilty to it in 3 weeks, that sample probably would not go to the criminalist and probably shouldn't go to the criminalist. Or if the charges were refused, it probably wouldn't go to the criminalist and probably shouldn't go to the criminalist. But the arrest and the investigative action took place on the presumptive Scott reagent drug test kit, which does not have the same accuracy percentage that NIBIN has. And so again, there's a conversation, I think, in education and understanding of what NIBIN is doing, how it's doing it, and how well it's doing it.
And Mike, I might want to jump on and add to yours, because something you said really stimulated a thought, and that is there's been studies on the accuracy of the technology. It's been consistently improved over the years, and I think that by bringing the stakeholders together, they can get a sense from as to the accuracy today. And if you look at the accuracy at the National Correlation Center giving out leads, Mike, the last I heard is they were like 98% and above.
99.6.
Go ahead, Mike. I'm sorry.
99.6, Pete.
Exactly. It's rising like every week. So I mean, these are important statistics to be communicated, and the only way you're going to get them is by sitting down with the cross-jurisdictional team and all the major players, including the people from ATF, that are going to give you those kinds of numbers.
Great, thank you guys very much. The next question is from Laura, and she indicated it's specifically for Pete. Do the laws in New Jersey, Delaware, and Nevada provide additional funding for the man hours required to accomplish the stated goals?
You know, that and that's a great question. Hopefully, before that legislation has been passed, there has been this collaboration amongst the major stakeholders. In New Jersey, that did not happen. As a matter of fact, I think I was the one to first tell the New Jersey State Police that the law had been passed. That said, I've worked extensively with the New Jersey State Police on their protocol, and it's amazing that they really didn't need any amounts of significant funds, I would say, to do what they do today. I don't think they hired anyone. I think they might have transferred one resource from the intelligence division into the lab to be what they call a forensic intelligence person, to call the labs whenever there was a NIBIN lead and see if they needed any other forensic testing done, or communicate the results of any other forensic testing. They did get another NIBIN machine from ATF. I know that they got one there, and I believe they invested a small amount of money in some intelligence software to keep track. Because look, the good news is here that when you put these crime gun intelligence protocols in place, you are going to start collecting an enormous amount of new crime gun intelligence. And the bad news is you're going to start collecting an enormous amount of crime gun intelligence. You're going to have to go back to your three-legged stool. And the only way you're going to probably balance your people, your processes, is with some technology. And I know New Jersey got some intelligence software that they're using. But having said that, they didn't need a lot of people. What they needed to do was change some of their internal policies that were actually holding them back. So they needed senior people involved in the discussions that can change policy. And like Mike said, in some instances, some policies, old policies, had to be rescinded. Now, that is not to say that the New Jersey experience is Delaware's experience, or Nevada's experience, or California's, or whomever. So the bottom line is, look, when you're thinking and acting together with all the right people from all the right places, and you're able to really have a collaborative discussion, that sometimes to get where you want to go, you got to buck up. Somebody's got to buy something. Another person, a piece of technology, an investment in something else to achieve the objective. Sometimes, let's not fool ourselves. That's the only way to balance that three-legged stool. But that should never be the first card that you play. You try to balance your people, processes, and technology the best you can. Show the appropriators and the budget people that you tried to do that, but there's still a gap. And then make the case to fill that gap with the resource that you need.
Great. Thank you so much, Pete. Folks, we have time for just a couple more questions here. The next one comes in from Rebecca. She asks, are the ATF correlation centers required to meet the MROS standards?
I'll give that to Mike. Yeah.
The ATF Correlation Center would, in the respect that they're receiving images from the autocorrelation. Obviously, they're not necessarily receiving. They're not doing acquisitions there, so they're not receiving evidence to do acquisitions. So none of the MROS would obviously apply. What applies to them is that when it's in their queue, when it's in their correlation queue, they are doing it within 24 to 48 hours and disseminating it immediately within 24 hours. So the MROS that do apply to them, certainly they are adhering to.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike. All right, our last question comes in from Catherine. It's kind of a multi-part question. She asks, is there a communications policy for informing the right investigators? Should that be included in the MROS? And then she comments, sustainability in communications is an issue with recent turnover in police investigators and administrators. And let me know if you need me to repeat any part of that, but I think they're just trying to find out, should we talk about communications policy in our overall crime gun intelligence policy, and should that have been included in the MROS?
So Mike, I'll handle the broad part if you handle the MROS part.
Okay.
So on a broad level, the answer is absolutely yes. And there are a number of best practices out there for dealing with communications. The idea of this listserv email list that everyone, all of the different partners subscribe to ahead of time is one way to make it easy to ensure that you're getting the information out to the right people. One thing we did in New Jersey at the very beginning when the new policies were being put in place was to have 4 regional symposiums strategically located across New Jersey, where the major stakeholders, police, prosecutors, and forensic teams were brought in. And when I say police, I mean including detectives, first responders. We put on 4 of these throughout the state of New Jersey to communicate what was done. Communication is a continual issue that must be addressed. And there's, like I said, a number of best practices to do it. The Phoenix PD had a 3-minute roll call video about the comprehensive collection of crime scene evidence and how it would be processed through E-Trace and NIBIN. Very effective. All they had to do was keep repeating it at every roll call session and rerun it over and over again. So that there's a number of best practices that are contained in some of the in that handout that has been referred to. So take a look, and I know that you see on the screen my contacts and Mike's. We'd be honored to take any questions or follow up from you guys offline and give you the best advice we can. But I'll turn the Emerald question over to Mike.
So if I understand it correctly, and I hope that I do, and so I hope that I address it, the MROS question is an interesting one, and one that comes up a lot about the MROS being laboratory or NIBIN site centric, and it is. And what good is that if there's no action on the lead, or if there's not evidence coming in from the law enforcement agency timely. Those are critical factors. But ones that ATF and I think the Crime Gun Intelligence Governing Board decided to address in best practices over standardized objectives. The reason for that is because it's very difficult to CODIS obviously has standards. NIBIN has standards. It's very difficult to have the discussion with law enforcement agencies about policy and instituting policy over and setting objectives as a federal agency. So it is a difficult thing. I feel for the NIBIN sites who have evidence coming in 6 weeks after recovery, and who also are dealing with law enforcement agencies that aren't following up on significant and clearly relevant leads, and sometimes who aren't a part of the feedback process to let them know what the results are. I will say this, however, and I've been traveling around the country a lot the last 2 or 3 years. Most law enforcement agencies, most law enforcement departments are absolutely on board and moving towards, if not already at, the place where they understand the MROS is putting some obligations on their laboratory, and they have an obligation as well to cooperate. We mentioned CGI policy and how it affects many different disciplines and jurisdictions. They understand, and almost to a T, everyone that I speak to understands the need to get the information in, or the evidence in quickly, and to act on it when it comes out. So if it's not done, that's unfortunate, but I would be willing to bet that that's short-lived. Most departments are moving towards, as I said, or already there, acting quickly on the intelligence coming out of that process and moving the evidence to the NIBIN site or the laboratory as quickly as possible.
Thanks so much, Mike. I want to thank again Stacy, Brandon, and Jim with Ultra Electronics Forensic Technology for all the amazing work they do in coordinating these webinars. And of course, thank our presenters today, Pete and Mike, for a really great job, not only presenting your content, but responding to some great questions from everyone in the audience. Before we close out for today, I want to give you, Pete, Mike, a chance for any closing comments. Maybe you first, Pete.
Well, one thing I'd like to say is um, I've written a book on this that forensic technology has been graciously involved in publishing and absorbing that cost to distribute it to law enforcement, prosecutors, and forensic people. And it's called the 13 Critical Tasks, an inside-out approach to solving more gun crime. And some of the tasks specifically address this communication issue. And within each chapter, there are best practices that are in use by successful organizations, not only in the United States, but sometimes outside as well. So if you go on the Ultra Electronics website, you can get a free electronic copy of that book. And when they're, to the extent that they're available and they're available often, you could actually get a complimentary copy. I just wanted to point that out, that there's a lot more information that is at your disposal.
Thanks, Pete. Mike?
Yeah, I just want to say that I appreciate having the opportunity to come on the webinar, have the discussion. This has been a passion of mine for a very long time. Not NIBIN, not MROS, not ATF necessarily, but working collaboratively and cooperatively with law enforcement everywhere to impact violent gun crime. I think that that's something that the technology has given us a leverage that we had not had before, and certainly one that I believe that as a law enforcement community, we can use to really make a change in the way violent gun crime is rising and push back against that. So that's my passion. I appreciate being retired and being able to stay involved in this discussion has been a real blessing for me. And I thank everybody for getting on and for FT for asking me to be part of it.
And thank you, Mike, for all the work that you've done. And thank you to our audience for attending this webinar and all the amazing work that you do out in the field. Please stay safe. And with that, this concludes today's Justice Clearinghouse webinar. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week. Bye-bye.